Paul and Barnabas' first missionary journey, Acts 13 to 14. At the end of Paul and Barnabas' first missionary journey, we read the following in Acts chapter 14, verses 26 through 27. They sailed to Antioch, where they had been commended to the grace of God for the work that they had fulfilled. And when they arrived and gathered the church together, they declared all that God had done with them, and how he had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles. The events of Acts 13 and 14 are presented to show how God's grace worked through Paul and Barnabas to open a door of faith to the Gentiles. That's missions. In this lecture, we will journey with Paul and Barnabas to the extent that we can see something of what they saw, experience something of what they experienced, and be reminded of the grace of God in this first mission into Gentile lands. In this lecture, we'll consider the following. What helped or hindered the mission of Paul and Barnabas? What type of a church was needed to support such a mission? Why did they go to these regions first? What was travel like? What strikes you about the places visited? How is the mission God's mission? Why go to Jews first? And did this first Christian mission of Paul and Barnabas in any way build on the indigenous religions? Other questions may come to mind, but these are some of the ones to have in mind as we continue this lecture. Let's begin with just questioning whether we should even be calling this the first missionary journey. Eckhart Schnabel, in his Paul the Missionary, Realities, Strategies, and Methods, actually divides Paul's mission into 15 periods, and they include Damascus, Arabia, Jerusalem, Cilicia and Syria, Antioch, Cyprus, Galatia, Macedonia, Achaia, Asia, Illyricum, Caesarea, Rome, Spain, and Crete. Schnabel concludes that Paul traveled around 15,000 miles, or 25,000 kilometers. Some 8,700 miles, or 14,000 kilometers of this, was by land. And Paul's first missionary journey, as it has traditionally been represented, is actually periods 6 and 7 of his wider missionary activity. We'll continue to use the language of first missionary journey, but with an understanding that Paul had been very active in missions before this journey took place. As we plot out Paul's and Barnabas' first missionary journey, several ancient resources might be noted to help us discover the paths and places along the way. There are, for example, the writings of those who traveled abroad about the same time to discover the world, its geography, its peoples, and customs. Such writings would include Strabo's Geography and Pliny the Elder's Natural History. Another type of writing at the time was an itinerary, such as the Antonine Itinerary of Augustus. There were also travel maps, such as the Tabula Peutinariana. Beyond these resources are the occasional references in other literature, present-day archaeology, and studies of the geography that is often unchanged to this day. I will in particular be using photos of the archaeological remains of the areas Paul and Barnabas went to on this journey from BiblePlaces.com. Paul and Barnabas were sent out by the church in Antioch sometime in the 40s. Antioch on the Orontes was the third largest city of the Roman Empire after Rome and Alexandria. It was established by Seleucus I Nicator, one of Alexander the Great's generals, near the end of the 4th century BC. From here, the rulers of the Seleucid Empire ruled, including the infamous Antiochus IV Epiphanes from the 2nd century BC, who attacked Israel. He is mentioned as the ultimate evil ruler in Daniel chapter 7. Today, the ancient city lies near the Turkish city of Antakya. While frankly unimpressive today, Antioch remains located in a beautiful and highly strategic region of southern Turkey, just a few miles from the border with Syria. It became a prize of the Roman Empire, and its population in early Roman times reached above 500,000 people. In Antioch, a very early Christian church can still be visited. The facade of St. Peter's gives some sense of grandeur to what is, in actual fact, a very early cave church, shown in the next picture. The followers of Jesus were first called Christians in Antioch, according to Acts chapter 11, verse 26. Antioch, along with Phoenicia and Cyprus, were where Jewish believers fled when a severe persecution broke out after Stephen was stoned to death in Jerusalem. These believers carried the message of Jesus Christ with them, but only to other Jews, according to Acts chapter 11, verse 19. Yet it was in Antioch that Jewish missionaries from Cyprus and Cyrene, the region in present Libya, first broke the barrier and proclaimed the gospel to non-Jews, to Hellenists. Not surprisingly, Antioch was the first place where Jewish and Gentile Christians had to work out how to fellowship with one another. And about this, we learn of an incident in Galatians chapter 2, verses 11 through 14, when Paul had to confront both Peter and Barnabas about their separating from Gentile believers at table. Not only was the church at Antioch significant in New Testament times, it was also where Ignatius was bishop in the early part of the 2nd century. And from here, John Chrysostom departed to become the famous Bishop of Constantinople in the 4th century A.D. Here is a picture of the cave church of St. Peter's in Antioch. To the left of the altar is actually a tunnel entrance. Caves and tunnels suggest perhaps a church under persecution. What can we say about Paul of Tarsus? We can perhaps say something about his education. Strabo, in his geography, says the inhabitants of the city apply to the study of philosophy and to the whole encyclical compass of learning with so much ardor that they surpass Athens, Alexandria, and every other place which can be named, where there are schools and lectures of philosophers. We also read the Stoic philosophers Antipater, Archidemus, and Nestor were natives of Tarsus. And furthermore, that Rome is best able to inform us what number of learned men to this city has produced, for it is filled with persons from Tarsus and Alexandria. Such, then, is Tarsus. Now we know that Paul, as an educated man, had an education that the whole church recognized, but that education, according to Acts chapter 22, verse 3, took place at the feet of Gamaliel, the rabbi in Jerusalem. We can surmise that Paul's father, as a Roman citizen and as a citizen of Tarsus, would have been concerned to educate his son. Granted that Paul was steeped in rabbinic education, might we also assume that he had familiarity with more classical training? Does Paul only engage theologically with Christian and Jewish interpretation of the Old Testament, or does he also on occasion show an awareness of the Greek and Roman intellectual context in which he ministered in the Roman Empire? Now, some of the answers to this question extend beyond the first missionary journey. One of the key places to look at is Acts chapter 17, when Paul appears before the Areopagus in Athens, and where he engages Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. There's also the question of Paul's rhetorical abilities, and while he is careful to distinguish his proclamation of the gospel from typical rhetoric among the philosophers and Greek orators of the day, he shows some remarkable ability at expressing his thoughts in different genres, not only in letters, but also in such passages as 1 Corinthians 13 or the opening chapter to the book of Ephesians. Paul seems quite capable of engaging the Gentile world of his day in the rhetoric of his day. The story of the first missionary journey begins with how Barnabas and Paul ended up in Antioch. When believers from Cyrene and Cyprus preached the gospel to non-Jews, the church grew remarkably in number. The disciples in Jerusalem heard about this and sent Barnabas to Antioch to investigate this church growth that included Gentiles. Barnabas then journeyed to Tarsus to find Paul, according to Acts chapter 11, verse 25. Paul, since his conversion, had been living in the shadowy periphery of the church because he had at one time persecuted it, and also because he was involved in mission work beyond the regions of Israel. After his conversion, Paul spent 3 years in Arabia and Damascus, according to Galatians chapter 1, verse 17, before returning to territory nearer home in Syria and Cilicia, according to Galatians 1:24. And this, in Paul's day, constituted the single Roman province of Syria. Paul accompanied Barnabas to Antioch, where the two worked together in ministry for 1 year. Now, Tarsus was located in a lovely area of present-day southern Turkey. This map depicts Roman administrative divisions at the time of Augustus Caesar's death in AD 14. The regions for Paul's and Barnabas' first missionary journeys are all in light brown, depicting that at this time they were under imperial governorship. You can see a small map on the top right that shows where Tarsus is, and also on that map is the city of Antioch. The distance was some 88 miles, and a trip one way would have taken about 6 days. Now, the first missionary journey began by boat from Antioch to Cyprus, and then continued on to regions in what is present-day Turkey that would be associated with the province of Galatia. Pictured here is what has to be one of the world's most remarkable roundabouts. In the middle are the ruins of Cleopatra's Gate in Tarsus, a notable feature from antiquity in the modern city of today. Cleopatra and Mark Antony met in Tarsus some 80 years before Barnabas arrived to find Paul. However, this arch was dedicated after the time of Paul in the 1st century. There are not many ruins that can be observed in Tarsus today. The modern city is built on top of it. These few uncovered ruins in Tarsus attests also to Rome's presence. The presence of a straight road often indicates Roman building, Roman urban planning. A fine example of a Roman road leading out of the city of Antioch can be seen here. Roman roads not only made rule of the vast empire possible, but also the spread of early Christianity. In Plutarch's words, the roads were carried straight across the countryside. They were paved with hewn stones and bolstered underneath with masses of tightly packed gravel. Hollows were filled in, and torrents or ravines that cut across the route were bridged. This Roman road lies just north of Paul's home city of Tarsus. What linked the Roman Empire's far-flung territories and provided a quick transportation of troops to maintain the Pax Romana, or Peace of Rome, became for the early Christians a way to stay connected and to spread the peace of Christ. Milestone markers marked the distances along the road. A Roman mile was 1,000 paces, or 2,000 steps, close to 5,000 feet. Today's mile is a little longer, at 5,280 feet. The Greek historian Herodotus reckoned that a traveler could cover a distance of 150 furlongs, or 19 miles, 30 kilometers, in one day by foot, if traveling on Roman roads. Travel along Roman roads might be by foot, horse, or donkey, chariot, or cart, but most travelers would have walked, perhaps in groups for protection, and perhaps with a donkey or two to bear the baggage. Now, this reconstruction of a Roman carriage is housed in Cologne, Germany, at the Römisch-Germanisches Museum. Paul was no stranger to ships, as we know from the book of Acts, as well as 2 Corinthians chapter 11. The Mediterranean was situated right at the center of the Roman Empire itself. Paul's very first missionary journey with Barnabas began with a ship taken from Antioch to Cyprus. With favorable winds, travel by ship could cover about 60 miles a day, or 100 kilometers. Yet it was dangerous, and the safe season for sailing was limited to early spring up to October. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 11:25-27, 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea, on frequent journeys in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from the Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, in toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. This gives us an idea of the kinds of things that were involved in taking the Word of God throughout the Roman Empire. Despite all of the developments that the Romans offered, such as their road system and the ships that traveled regularly from port to port, there were still many dangers. And note that Paul writes this, 2 Corinthians 11, before the famous boat journey that he takes from Caesarea to Rome in the book of Acts. Not far to the north and a little bit west of Tarsus are the Taurus Mountains. And if one wanted to go from Tarsus to Pisidian Antioch, one could go through the Taurus Mountains in about 14 days. It would be 206 Roman miles. Of course, Paul and Barnabas left from Antioch further south, 4 days south, and they left by boat to go to Cyprus. It seems as if that was their original plan, and not that they had planned necessarily to go on to this area beyond the mountains in Galatia. John Mark abandoned them as they got to the coast of what's present-day southern Turkey, and did not continue with them in the ministry in this southern area of Galatia, beyond the mountains here. So travel plans seem to have developed on the first missionary journey for Paul and Barnabas. Here again are the Taurus Mountains. Paul and Barnabas would have had supplies with them on their journey. Paul most likely carried the tools of his tent-making trade, as we learn about in Acts chapter 18, verse 3. He would not have carried many clothes. Travelers typically wore a tunic and a traveling cloak, which was a rectangular cloth made of wool that also served as a blanket. In prison at the end of his life, Paul asks Timothy to bring his cloak to him, 2 Timothy 4:13. Paul also asks for his parchments. These are animal skins on which one could write. Parchments could be washed and reused, but they were not as cheap as papyrus. Paul may have also then had a writing tablet made of wood, metal, or even ivory that was covered with wax for taking down notes, and then one could reuse it. Paul would have used reed pens and ink. Typically, any letter would have been copied before being sent. Also in their baggage, Paul and Barnabas would have had money for transportation, food, inns, if they did use inns, and tolls. And they likely would have had cooking and eating utensils, food and drink for their journey. And so if they took these many things and perhaps a few others, they may have needed a donkey when they were traveling on these Roman roads to carry their items. The overland route from Tarsus to Pisidian Antioch, the route that Paul and Barnabas did not take on their first missionary journey, would have passed through the Taurus Mountains via the Cilician Gates, which you see here. This route would have been difficult or impossible in winter. On two occasions, that is in 1 Corinthians 16:6 and Titus 3:12, Paul makes plans not to travel in winter. There is also a concern about the heat of summer, on the other hand, and we read in a letter that Pliny the Younger wrote to the Emperor Trajan in the early 2nd century AD that traveling by sea in summer was considered much more appealing. After centuries of uncertainty as to the location of some of the cities visited by Paul and Barnabas, the location of all the places mentioned in Acts 13 and 14 seems to have been settled in the 20th century. Only recently, in the last few years, has any excavation been done at Lystra, and Derbe still remains unexcavated. Other cities have, over time, been excavated, and yet there still seems to be much more that could be done archaeologically, so further discoveries should be coming. Paul and Barnabas traveled from Antioch, then, to its seaport, Seleucus, on their first missionary journey. It's from this harbor that they would have caught their ship to Cyprus. From Seleucus, they traveled by boat to Cyprus, and Cyprus is mentioned in 6 passages in the book of Acts. In Acts 4, verse 36, we read that Joseph, better known to us as Barnabas, was a native of Cyprus. This fact explains the first port of call, then, on the missionary journey. There were personal connections. When Barnabas and Paul reached a disagreement about Mark early on the second missionary journey, Barnabas and Mark set sail to continue missionary work in Cyprus, Acts 15, verse 39. This portion of the old map, the Tabula Peutingnaria, shows Cyprus with Salamis in the northeast and Paphos on the far west side of the island. Paul and Barnabas traversed the entire island, and here are the ancient roads of the Romans marked on the map. They traveled proclaiming the gospel. In Acts 11:19 through 20, we read about other Jewish Christians from Cyprus than Barnabas. One of these, according to Acts 21:16, was named Mnason, M-N-A-S-O-N, Mnason, who was also called an early disciple. Acts 13:4 through 5 mentions that Paul and Barnabas preached to Jews in the synagogue in Salamis on Cyprus, right in the northern eastern part of the island. According to later church tradition, Barnabas was originally from Salamis, and in AD 75, he was stoned to death by Jews. The story goes on to say that he was buried in a secret grave, and that it was discovered in the 5th century near the city. After ministering the length of the island of Cyprus, Paul and Barnabas arrived at the far westerly town of Paphos, where they met with the Roman proconsul Sergius Paulus. Here is a picture of the Paphos castle and the harbor. When they were opposed by a magician named Elymas Bar Jesus, Paul cursed him with blindness. According to Pliny the Elder, who died in AD 79, a new type of magic had recently developed in Cyprus. This he writes in his Natural History. Thus, on an island where magic had gained considerable attention, the immediate blinding of a magician would have been most impressive. Indeed, it made Sergius Paulus a believer. According to Pliny the Elder in his Natural History, magic was a combination of medical remedies, religion, and astrology. We read, "For pains in the side, the heart of a hoopoe is highly esteemed. Ashes, too, of burnt snails that have been boiled in a tisane, snails being sometimes applied in the form of a liniment alone. Potions employed for this purpose have a sprinkling in them of the ashes of a mad dog's skull." While it held sway with many people in every country, according to Pliny the Elder, magic was the most deceptive of all arts. This quotation that we've just read on this slide is an example of the medical side of magic. The text of Acts refers to Elymas Bar Jesus as a magician and false prophet, and Paul says that he was, quote, "full of deceit and trickery, and a child of the devil, and an enemy of everything that is right." Acts 13, verses 6 and 10. His days of trickery, of offering false remedies to people, were immediately over once he was blinded by God. This inscription bears the name of Lucius Sergius Paulus. The Sergius Paulus, we understand, that is mentioned in the book of Acts, where Paul meets him in Paphos on Cyprus. But this inscription is to be found in the museum for Pisidian Antioch. And that was Paul and Barnabas' next port of call, according to Acts, after Paphos. They didn't seem to preach the gospel in Perga at first, but they pressed on to Pisidian Antioch. It may well be, there's good circumstantial evidence for this, that this part of the missionary journey was something planned in consultation with Sergius Paulus in Cyprus. And so they had new connections that they could make in Pisidian Antioch. Sergius Paulus was proconsul of Rome on Cyprus for 3 years in the mid-40s, when Paul and Barnabas were there. Afterwards, in AD 47, he was appointed to be one of the keepers of the banks and channels of the Tiber River in Italy. The inscription in Rome that mentions this refers to him as L. Sergius Paulus. And so we surmise that this is the same person. That would then put Paul and Barnabas in Cyprus and on this first missionary journey no later than 47 AD. Perga was the capital city of the region of Pamphylia along the coast, which is today's southern Turkey. In Paul's day, one could sail up the Sestris River and debark near Perga. Acts mentions that Paul and Barnabas began their travels in Asia from Perga on their first missionary journey, but it only records that they, quote, spoke the word there as they were concluding this ministry. Acts chapter 14, verse 25. The city of Perga has an ancient history, but its archaeological remains pertain primarily to the Greek and Roman periods. In the 3rd century BC, the Greeks built a wall around the city with 2 large round towers that are still visible today, as you can see here in the picture. The city first came under the rule of the Ptolemies, then the Seleucids, then the kingdom of Pergamum, and finally in 133 BC, it came under the rule of the Romans. The city expanded, and so the Hellenistic wall was torn down, leaving the towers, and a new Roman wall for the city was built further out. Here you can see through the Greek Hellenistic towers up the main road to the north with the Acropolis in the distance. Paul and Barnabas may have come to Perga simply because it was their entry point into Asia after sailing from Cyprus. There might have been already some Christians in Pamphylia, the region in which Perga was the first city, since Acts chapter 2, verse 10 makes a point of mentioning that there were Jews from the region of Pamphylia who heard the gospel on the day of Pentecost. However, to this date, we found no archaeological evidence of Jews in the city. No synagogue, no Stars of David, no indications at all of Jewish presence in the city. But it's hard to believe that they were not here if they were indeed in Pamphylia itself. Most ruins at Perga come from a time later than when Paul and Barnabas visited there in the 40s. This main street that you see was lined with columns during the reign of Tiberius, the emperor, in AD 14 to 37, so prior to Paul and Barnabas and John Mark's arrival. It was about 65 feet wide and 650 feet long. It ran from the Acropolis, from which this picture is taken, on the north side of the city, to the southern Hellenistic and Roman gates in the distance. Awnings connected the shops along the road to the columns. Perga also had a palestra, a wrestling school, which was dedicated to the Emperor Claudius, and we know that Claudius reigned from AD 41 to 54. So it could have been under construction or having just been built, or perhaps even not quite built yet, when Paul and Barnabas were there on the first missionary journey. The city had a theater for about 14,000 spectators that was built before Paul's time. It also had a stadium that could seat 12,000 people, but that was built later in the first century or possibly the early second century. It also had northern and southern bathhouses. And here on the bottom left of the slide, you can see one of the rooms of the bathhouse, the Colydrium, the hot bathhouse in the southern baths of Perga. The temple of Artemis was located outside the city, and it has not yet been excavated. But this must have dominated city life, and some important persons connected with the temple became prominent in the city in the early second century and responsible for great expansion of the city and things that were erected in the city to beautify it. Here we see a picture from the Louvre, a picture of a statue in the Louvre of Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. The road from Perga to Antioch might have passed along the coast to the southeast to a town called Sidi, which is now Manavgat in Turkey. That was a distance of 30 Roman miles. Paul and Barnabas then could have headed up that direction north for another 80 miles before reaching Antioch. But there were alternatives, and we don't know which route they took. An alternative route from Perga to Antioch might be to head northwest in a slow arc on the Via Sebaste. This would have been the longest route, though. And a third possibility would have been to head directly north on a path through the hills. Perhaps a more difficult journey, but a straighter one. You can see in this map that between Perga and Pisidian Antioch lay some rugged territory as well as some beautiful lakes. Pisidia was a region in the large Roman province of Galatia. Pisidian Antioch stands today in ruins. Pictured here by the clump of trees are what is left of its city walls. As so often in this part of the world, the garlanded bull appears in connection with religious ceremony. A Byzantine church here at Antioch sits above the ruins of a former synagogue. In the synagogue of Antioch, Paul delivered his famous speech in Acts chapter 13. The floor of the church has a mosaic with Psalm 42, verse 4, inscribed on it. The ruins of a temple dedicated to Augustus Caesar was a central feature of the city when Paul and Barnabas visited Antioch. The imperial cult of such temples celebrated the divinity of the emperor. Archaeological explorations and ancient writings state that the city was established by the Syrian ruler Antioch I in 280 BC. In 25 BC, the ancient city that stood here became a Roman colony, Colonia, Caesarea, Antiochia. 3,000 Roman veterans coming from Rome itself settled in Antioch, and they were settled by the Emperor Augustus. Remember, he dies in AD 14. Thus, the city comprised native Pisidians, Jews, and Romans. Here is the major Roman road, the Decumanus Maximus, in Antioch. The Decumanus Maximus led to the theater for the city of Antioch. The Romans were not only famous for their roads, but also their aqueducts that provided water to the citizens. And here are the ones outside the city of Antioch. Here is our ancient map again. Well, sometimes it's difficult to figure out where towns and cities are. It does show the road system. It is a map that is a copy of an original map produced in the 4th and 5th centuries. Antioch stood in a strategic location at the intersection between a road from the north to the south and another from the west to the east. The trip from Antioch to Iconium along the Via Sebasta went southeast for about 45 miles, and then east for another 45 miles, a distance then of 90 miles. According to Pliny the Elder, Iconium was the principal city among the 14 cities of Lycaonia. This he records in his Natural History. Yet a monument discovered by Sir William Ramsay in the early 20th century declares that Iconium was a Phrygian city. Apparently, the border between the regions of Phrygia and Lycaonia lay between Iconium and Lystra. At Iconium, Paul and Barnabas began their ministry in the normal way, within the local synagogue, that is. The presence of a strong Jewish opposition in both Antioch and Iconium may account for the issues regarding circumcision mentioned in Paul's letter to the Galatians, the Roman province in which these regions lay. Another feature of their ministry was signs and wonders. The cities of Lystra and Derbe lay in the territory of Lycaonia. Lystra was made a Roman colony in 6 BC. We do not know for certain whether this territory was included in the Roman province of Galatia at the time. If so, these cities would later have been among the recipients of Paul's letter to the Galatians, that is, churches in these cities comprising southern Galatia, the province of Galatia, not the region. Lystra lay southwest of Iconium about 25 miles. It was not on the main road, not on the Via Sebasta. Acts tells us that Paul and Barnabas left Iconium because of a plot to stone them. Somewhat off the road and not on the main road, a city like Lystra may have been a place they thought they could lie low. We do not know for certain whether this territory was included in the Roman province of Galatia at the time. If it was, and we are assuming it was, then these cities would later have been among the recipients of Paul's letter to the Galatians. Lystra lay southwest of Iconium, some 25 miles. It was not on the Via Sebasta. Acts tells us that Paul and Barnabas left Iconium because of a plot to stone them. An off-the-road town such as Lystra seemed a sensible place for them to lie low. In Lystra, Paul and Barnabas were received as the gods Zeus and Hermes because they healed a man who had been crippled from birth. Zeus was the chief of the Greek gods, also known as Jove in the Roman religion, and Hermes was the messenger of the gods as well as the patron deity of merchants. Paul, as chief orator, was taken as Hermes, and Barnabas as Zeus. The veneration of Zeus and Hermes seems to be the result of syncretism, that is, the mixing of the traditional religion of the area with some other religion, in this case, the religion of the Greeks and of the Romans. The original religion of the area had spoken of a father god and of a son god. Apparently, these were now identified as Zeus and Hermes since the coming of Hellenism. According to Acts, the priests of the temple of Zeus, which stood near the city gates, brought oxen and garlands to perform a sacrifice to Paul and Barnabas. Acts 14, verse 13. They barely managed to restrain the local population from sacrificing to them. The Roman poet Ovid, in his work called the Metamorphoses, told a story that gives background to Lystra's identification of Paul and Barnabas with Hermes and Zeus. Ovid himself died not long before, in AD 17 or 18. His poem begins, "To Phrygian realms my grandsire's government. Not far from thence is seen a lake, the haunt of coots and of the fishing cormorant. Here Jove with Hermes came, but in disguise of mortal men concealed their deities." Ovid's poem continues with the story of how Zeus came with Hermes to the Phrygian hills and went house to house, dressed as wanderers, asking for food and shelter. They were turned away again and again until a poor elderly couple received them. The gods then rewarded them for their hospitality and destroyed their neighbors. As the concluding lines to Ovid's poem suggest, the local population felt an obligation, at the risk of their own destruction, to honor two wanderers that they thought may well be Zeus and Hermes. And to honor them, they would themselves be honored. Ovid's story concludes, "And such as honored heaven shall heavenly honor share." Having avoided being honored as Zeus and Hermes, Acts tells us that Jews came to Lystra from Antioch and Iconium to stir up the crowds against Paul and Barnabas. Paul was stoned and left for dead, but was well enough to leave with Barnabas for Derbe the next day. Could this be the weakness of the flesh that Paul mentions in Galatians 4:13? It was in great weakness of the flesh that he first proclaimed the gospel to the Galatians. Paul again visited Lystra on his second missionary journey, and probably Timothy came from here. Derbe is essentially a mound today. It stood on the road from Pisidian Antioch to the Cilician gates through the Taurus Mountains and was a customary city for goods entering the province of Galatia. During the time of Claudius, the city was honored with the title Claudio Derbe. Thus, at the time of Paul's and Barnabas' visit to Derbe, it was a strongly pro-Roman town. Were they to have traveled further east, they would have been outside the protection offered Paul and maybe Barnabas as a Roman citizen. Whether this was the reason why they went no further or not, we do not know. The need to strengthen churches in Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch may have been just as strong a reason for backtracking from this point. Thus, Paul and Barnabas' first missionary journey included ministry in Cyprus, Barnabas' home island, and the southern regions of the Roman province of Galatia, which included the regions of Pisidia, Phrygia, and Lycaonia. This southern area of Galatia lay to the immediate west of the region that Paul had already evangelized, that is, his home province of Cilicia, the two provinces being divided by the Taurus Mountains. All we learn from Acts is that Paul and Barnabas made many disciples in Derbe, which was also their final destination. The apostles then appointed elders in each church. Perhaps one of these was Gaius in Derbe, who would later be part of Paul's missionary team on his third missionary journey, Acts 20, verse 4. It may be a noteworthy point to make that Paul tended to pick up people like Timothy or Gaius from churches that he had established to be part of his missionary work. Here we see the very recent excavations that have just begun to take place in Derbe. A team from Selçuk University in Turkey has begun excavations, and excavators believe that they've found an ancient religious building. So more news forthcoming on what they will find in future digs. Having completed their ministry in the Roman province of Galatia, Paul and Barnabas began their return journey to Antioch on the Orontes, to the church that sent them out. As already noted, it was on this return journey that they preached the gospel, or the word of God, in Perga. They then went from Perga to the nearby port of Attalia, pictured here, today called Kalaetsi. It's the old city region of modern-day Antalya. Attalia stood 9.4 miles southwest from Perga. Antalya is Turkey's 8th largest city and a major sea resort. Upon returning to Antioch, Paul and Barnabas called the church together to report that a, quote, door of faith for the Gentiles had indeed been opened. Acts 14, verse 27. And then the very next chapter in Acts reports the story of the council that took place in Jerusalem that addressed the issue of what do we do with Gentile converts.